Welcome to Easy Style with Sami. I'm your host, Sami Bedell-Mulhern. Each episode, I invite a friend, family member, colleague, or just someone I've met on this journey called life to come and share their personal style and approach to business, parenting, life, and everything in between. You'll hear motivational and inspirational stories that will help you refine and build your own personal style. Remember, style is easy when it comes from within. Hey friends, we are back with another episode of Easy Style with Sami, and my guest today is Jen Anderson. Jan. Did I say Jan? Jen Anderson.
That's okay. It happens.
Been too fast. Well, Jen, thanks for being here today. This has been a long time coming.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to be here.
So Jen and I know each other all the way back to high school. We went to high school together. I think I've loved that we've kind of had so many different versions of our connection, from like working together in a nonprofit and like connecting as moms and kind of kiddos growing up. But I think some of my most favorite conversations that we've had have been around like what we're going to talk about today with regards to how do we help our kids be the best versions of themselves while also respecting the uniqueness that they have with regards to, anything, right? Talents, mental health care, ADHD, all the things that, that we're going to get into today. But it's just been so great having somebody else that you can go to kind of talk to about how do we deal with the school and how do we do that. So those have been some of my most favorite conversations. But I just would love if you would kind of introduce yourself and kind of let people know a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, sure. So like Sami said, we've known each other forever and have worked together in the past in the arts nonprofit field. And I'm still an artist, currently homeschooling one of my children, a micro baker, gardener, lots of things, yoga teacher. So I still dabble a bit in all of the things that I've done over the years as far as health and wellness. But right now focusing on homeschooling our youngest child for the rest of the school year and moving towards summer pretty quickly here. So just juggling kids' schedules. And I would say that's job number one.
Yep. Wait, but quick question. What is micro baking?
Okay, so in the state of Minnesota, you can get what's called a cottage license. So you're considered like a micro baker, cottage baker out of your home. So I make scones, and my business is called Flora and Flower. And I have a cut flower garden. So this summer I'll be selling bouquets from my garden when I have them available. And then I make baked goods that have like edible flowers pressed into them and kind of flower themed, but also just like a basic cinnamon scone. So it's just a fun thing I just started. I just really enjoy, I've been baking my scones for years and years, and everybody always says, you should sell these. They're so good. And I've perfected the recipe over the year. And so yeah, I just decided to go ahead and do it for fun. So.
Oh, that's amazing. And do your girls let bake with you in the kitchen?
Yes, they do. I will say it's less stressful to just do it myself, particularly for this. But yeah, for sure. Especially my youngest, Stella, just absolutely loves to bake. So we do a lot of that.
I love that. Okay, well, let's get into the topic at hand, because I know you and I could just talk about all sorts of things all day long.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But one of the things that I think is so hard in parenting is kind of how do we advocate for our kids in school? And I think it's so much different than when we went to school, for sure. And I think a lot of things that are kind of out there, and it totally depends on where kids go to school as well. But kind of when for you, did you kind of realize, you know what, I can't just be a passive parent and just kind of let things happen and have to kind of step in and really force conversations and have conversations with the schools to kind of figure out what it is that I want my kids for success, how do we do that?
Yeah. So that goes back quite a ways. And before I begin, I just want to say that before doing this today, I did have a discussion with both of my girls. So nothing I speak about here today is anything they're not okay with me talking about. I think it's really important, particularly for sensitive and neurodivergent kids, to give them as much agency and autonomy as possible. And so we kind of have a rule in our house, like nothing about them without them. And you may have heard that in the neurodivergent community. Like, it's really important that I'm not telling their story. I'm telling my perspective as their mom, but their story is their own. So just for everyone to know, like, that's the number one way I advocate for my kids, is letting them speak their own truth and tell their own story. I'm the parent, so I'm guiding some of that story at this point, but it's important for them to have that ownership. So in regards to knowing when I needed to step in a little bit more, in order to address that, I'll speak to a little bit like where my girls are in the neurodivergent realm, without getting too specific. Both of my girls are neurodivergent, and so we're familiar with a lot of things, from ADHD to autism spectrum, anxiety, which I also consider a form of neurodivergence, and just a lot of different things within that realm. But for my girls, they really float in that space where they're not quite fitting in as far as school goes, with the standards of being disabled, but they're also not quite typical. And I think a lot of those kids are kind of lost in the system because they don't know where they quite fit in. And as far as on paper for the school, there is no place they really fit in. They're kind of lost in the just regular classroom, but also not quite getting what they need in like SPED services always. So that for me was our experience. And that's where I had to step in as a parent and really advocate for my girls, because a lot of their challenges are hidden. And, often teachers will say, well, she's one of my best students. She's really quiet. She never disrupts the class. She, does what she's supposed to. And like, yeah, that's true. A lot of these kids are really quiet and just kind of sliding by, but not getting what they need either.
I think especially with females, especially with girls.
Absolutely.
Because we heard the same thing. Yeah, we heard the same thing about our daughter. And, but internally she was coming home and like melting on the floor and like losing everything because like she had to work so hard all day long just to like try to fit, like what you're saying, fit in with what she thinks she's supposed to be.
Exactly. And that's called masking. And that's a huge thing for neurodivergent girls in particular, only because it's more difficult for girls, I think, only because there's so much more social structure and expectation around girls' behavior as far as being nice and, being respectful. Like, one of the number one things that gets attached to kind of a label to girls on the spectrum or girls with other neurodivergent qualities is rude. She's rude. Either she's not speaking when spoken to, or maybe speaking without a filter, like being very black and white, very direct. And so it's like they're either the good girls and very quiet, or they're rude and there's no in between for them. And so that's really difficult, especially in the classroom setting.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like, to your point, also the school system has like two ways that they deal with kids, right? It's the IEP or it's the 504. And there's like nothing really also in between that. And they both come with such rigorous, well, the 504 doesn't, but the IEP comes with such rigorous structure to it. And so again, varying depending on the school district you're in can be a very different experience. And sometimes you have to push harder and sometimes you don't. But
right.
Yeah.
And
I
even
think that's
within
a hard spot.
Right, exactly. And I found I even had to really advocate and educate within those parameters. For our oldest, for a time, she did have an IEP. And when you have an IEP for your child, you go to an IEP review to put it in place, and you review, what they've written for goals. And what I found for my oldest when she had one of those is that the goals were really based on how others perceived her rather than actually being supportive of her and her needs. So it was more so working with the goal of trying to make her appear more typical and not have needs in the classroom setting rather than just accommodating her needs, right? Like, and they were accommodating her needs in the meantime, but the goal written on paper was always like very ableist language, and very much trying to just make her appear typical in order to pass out of the IEP system. And that was a real problem for me, just the language of it and the way it was regarded. And so that's really where I started to advocate pretty firmly, even down to like what language was appropriate.
Well, and how do you know, because I know when we went through this process, my daughter is a 504, my son is on an IEP. And when you go through this process the first time, you don't really even know what you can and can't ask for, or what services, they're required to offer you, or like, it was always interesting to me when we moved from Oregon to Minnesota, like the difference in the language in our school district, the different services that they were willing to offer that I would have never asked for because I just didn't know. So how did you educate yourself to even be able to say, okay, well, you should be doing these things. These things are something that, I need to message and craft for my daughter to get her the support. Like, where did that information come from for you?
I really just dove in, and, this is just kind of my personality too, to like really dive into something and self-educate as much as possible. So I did a lot of reading. I attended conferences where Temple Grandin spoke, who's well known in the autism community. And reading a lot in particular about the way girls present differently on the spectrum and with ADHD, and just educating myself on, as best as I could, what their perspective, my daughter's perspective of their experiences might be like. So that meant listening to people who are actually autistic or actually have ADHD and have anxiety, and listening to those voices rather than just like the clinical, stereotypical versions of their diagnosis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then through all of that, is that kind of where you also learn, like you mentioned, like the ableist language and the way that, to look at the goals that they're giving you, and is this really helping to support my child, or is this just to make it easier for the school, right?
Right.
How do you inside your house, or how do you work with your girls on kind of, here's how people talk about you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or so you, like as in any person that's neurotypical, but here's how we talk about it in the house. Like, how do you kind of have those conversations with them so that they feel comfortable or that they can kind of self-advocate for themselves as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I think language is super important. With any child, when we're raising our children as a parent, a lot of us have learned and work with, kids have big emotions a lot of the time as they're developing. Mm-hmm. And so I know as a parent, something I learned very quickly is the more language I could give my children to express what they're feeling, the more language I could give them around emotions, the better they could understand what they were feeling, articulate their needs. And I think it's the same with neurodiversity and neurodivergent brains. The more language you can give them to describe the way their brain works, the better they'll be able to understand and advocate for themselves. And so for me, it's an idea of like, I know a lot of people are afraid to take their child in to get diagnosed or assessed because they're afraid of the label. And when they're saying that, they're referring to like the word autism spectrum or ADHD. Like they're afraid of their child being labeled with something. And in our home, we just really flip that script. Like to us, those words are not labels, that's language. And it's language to describe the unique way your brain works. To me, yep. Labels, all of those things outside of this safe space that people attach. So like we talked about before, like you're really rude, or, you're too loud, or you're too quiet, or all of those things. To me, those are the labels. And so we've really raised us with that mindset. Like these words don't define all of who you are. They're just language to help describe an aspect of how you operate and how your brain works.
Well, and I think too that for me, this is my own personal opinion, that as things are shifting, I don't really know a kid that my son is friends with that doesn't also have some form of ADHD. I don't know any kids right now, especially coming out of COVID and all of the shifts, that aren't dealing with some level of anxiety or some level of mental health concerns. I mean, my daughter will sit at lunch and they'll talk about they all have therapists. It's so much more common and normal now. I like the term neurodivergent and now I'm missing or neurotypical and neurodivergent and ADHD and autism spectrum. I feel like, just kind of piggyback off what you're saying, like everybody now has a label. So it's not, it is just, understanding like this is brain works, and I'm gonna just learn like the school. I think a lot of schools are coming around to like, this is just a different learning style. It's not necessarily it's not a disease or anything. My kid goes to, they have an ADHD learning lab at his school, and it's after school, and all these, kid who has ADHD gets to come, and they get to work in an environment where they've got paras and people there to help them with their homework in ways that they need to process it. So I think there's lots of things that are happening that we as adults just need to let go of our own whatever with it, because the kids don't care.
Right, exactly. And I think for adults, that's our conditioning, right? Like that's how we've learned, like everybody needs to be the same, like, and standards for school, like everybody has to meet a certain standard. You all need to learn the same things and in the same way. And, inclusion for these kids is super important in the classroom, right? So it doesn't work to just remove these kids from the classroom and have them, be doing their own thing separately, because I think it's so important. Like you're saying now, I know very few people who I wouldn't place on that neurodivergent spectrum, right? And once you have kids and who are neurodivergent and you learn about it, you start looking around you and even at yourself and saying, oh, wow, I actually know a lot of people who are neurodivergent and they just don't know it themselves, right? And that was a big part of it for me too, and both my husband and I as parents, to see some aspects of our girls and the way they function, kind of being a mirror for ourselves and realizing some things about ourselves and who we were as children that were like, okay, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, right? And so, like you said, this is a huge part of the population, I think even more so than we know now, even as common as it is now. And so to start recognizing these words, again, just as language that describe the way somebody operates, and knowing too that every kid with ADHD isn't a monolith, right? Like I think there's like 7 different types of ADHD that we know about right now. So some of those are the really quiet kids. They're not the stereotypical hyperactive, right? Some kids are the more like outgoing, like big personalities. And some kids are both. There's a combined ADHD where they have both of those aspects. So like you said, just learning that, hey, kids in general each learn and operate uniquely. So what we're doing as parents and as educators is just kind of building a map for each of those kids. And it's unique to each of them. They're going to get where they want to go in life. And certainly there are kids on the spectrum that have comorbids that create more disability for them. But I think every kid on the spectrum has moments of disability, right? Every kid with ADHD has moments of disability. And I think where we go amiss in school and as parents is to just assume they're okay all the time and not checking in with them on their experience of life and what they're feeling, trying to navigate a world that's really built for neurotypical people and neurotypical learners. We're amiss when they're quiet to not check in and say, hey, how are you really doing? How are you feeling about this? Because a child only knows themselves and they know that is their normal, right? And yet when we don't give kids this language to identify with how their brain maybe works differently, our kids kind of internalize that and they feel different. So whether or not you take them to get the actual diagnosis, I know parents are so afraid of their child being othered. a child can other themselves very easily.
Yeah.
Just their own awareness of like, something just feels off. Like I kind of feel like an alien here in this environment and I don't know why. So there must be something wrong with me. And I think when we give them appropriate language to say, hey, nothing's wrong with you. You just have a brain that operates differently and that's okay. And let's figure out what is your personal map? Like, what is your way forward? How do you learn? How do you engage with people? How do you socialize?
Yeah.
And let's talk about that and empower you as an individual rather than, and giving you powerful language about how you operate so that you can feel okay about going out into the world and knowing, hey, some people might try to other you, but at least that's external and you can walk away from that. When it comes from inside of you and it's internal, that is really tough to navigate for a child.
Yeah, so good. I know one of the exercises that my daughter's therapist had her work through when it comes to because like you mentioned, we only know what we know. We don't know our experience, always know how to explain our experience. So when she was trying to explain her feelings, because a lot of times we adults will like, well, are you mad or are you frustrated? Like we'll give them terms, but they don't necessarily know how that manifests for them. So she would tell her to come up with her own word for her emotion. So like if the kid that was really frustrating to her, they came up, it's like silly words. It would be like she might say after the grouch, like that's how she talked about that feeling. So like they attach it. So like you can use these things that they can they don't have to identify it with a word. They can identify it with something else that they've experienced, and then can start to work through that conversation and help them identify, okay, well, what you're saying other people would typically use mad or sad or, just to kind of help them, guide them through figuring out what that emotion really is without us self-imposing, well, if you're acting like this, then you must feel this. That's not also always the case.
Right, exactly. Like that's a really important lesson that we learned as parents too with our girls. Like behavior is not always an indication of actual feeling, right? Like behavior is a coping mechanism for what you're feeling. It may not match the actual feeling. Like for instance, with kids who have anxiety, that often comes out as anger. And like we were talking about when they mask all day at school and kind of hold everything in, when they come home to their safe space, there's a huge explosion. Like we experienced a lot of that. And that's like the after school letdown, where like, I'm home, I'm safe, I'm going to let it all out. Everything I held in today is going to come out at home. That's really typical of these kiddos. And when you're creating that safe space at home, which hopefully as a parent you are, that's going to happen and you're going to have some of that. And so knowing like, hey, this behavior seems angry or seems really volatile or seems, really frustrated, but maybe it's like hurt or sadness or just straight up confusion. Often with my girls, I know they were just confused about things that happened at school, whether it be social things or, an activity they did at school that was just confusing for them. And that just created that internal frustration that then comes out as anger at home. So there can be lots of different triggers and the behavior doesn't always match what's actually going on. So as a parent, learning to kind of like dig and help your child dig to that root cause, because a lot of kids on the spectrum too do have trouble identifying what they're feeling. And I think for them, it's like very somatic, like they feel it in their body. It feels like a very like real sense in their body, but they don't know how to name it. So helping your child begin to name things, that was definitely a tool that we've used at home to create that safe space of like, hey, whatever you're feeling or expressing here is okay. And you're not going to be punished for coming home from school and letting it all out. Like, I'm glad you feel safe with me to do that. But let's talk about when they're calm, where did it come from and what can we do about it?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been hard for us to navigate, so I would love your thoughts on this, is how do we, as kids continue to grow and we're learning and we have really good conversation, communication with kids and whatnot. There comes a point where you start to question, like, okay, are they now using this as a crutch? So, for example, my daughter has a panic attack. Sometimes it takes her 2 days to like really get back to normal, right? And for that day or two later, sometimes she can super sensory overload, like going to school is really hard. And so we really struggled with that. How do we support her in what she needs, without turning it into a crutch that maybe at some point she can, well, I'm having anxiety moments, so I'm avoid this thing that's hard.
Right. So, and like, I'm not an expert by any means. This is still something we're navigating too. Yeah. But my oldest is now a teenager, right? And so, and she feels very empowered by her diagnosis. She's very open about it. She has preferred language around her diagnosis. She has preferred ways of self-advocating, but she's an awesome self-advocate. And I think just being comfortable in her house with the language and talking very openly, having those conversations has really led her to a place of being able to feel empowered by it. But certainly there's things like that are, you have to remember, like, whatever is typical, like for us right now of a typical teenager, it's just like times 100 for our neurodivergent kiddos, right? So she's in that teen phase of kind of wanting to like retreat to her room, kind of self-isolate, be on her phone a lot. And we're always trying to find a balance of, you know, how much of this is about how her brain works, how much is like typical teen behavior, and how much do we push, right? Because we're not wanting to shame her, because certainly school takes a lot of her energy. She's at a charter school right now, which is in our public school district. And so I understand, and we know school absolutely does take a lot of her energy. You know, that kind of forced socialization all day long takes a lot out of her as a neurodivergent kiddo. She needs a lot of downtime, a lot of recuperating. And so the way we're navigating that right now is, again, just talking to her about it. Like, hey, I get it. Because of who you are and the way your brain works, you need extra downtime. It takes you longer to recover than the average kiddo from just a week at school. And you know what? All kids going through the week at school are struggling by the weekend and ready to just chill. We get that. And we get that it's more intense for you as a neurodivergent kid. But let's find our edge here. And that's something we're talking to her a lot about, finding your edge. Where is that place where, like, you're pushing yourself just gently out of your comfort zone while still honoring who you are as a person? So finding that balance of, like, you know what? Friday after school, Friday evening, please don't plan any activities for me. I need to come home and just veg out for the night. Totally get it, right? Like, going to give you that space and allow her to do that. And then we have to just kind of gently push her, because over the weekend, we want to have family time. We want to get out and do things as a family. And if it were up to her, she would just stay home, right? But we find that when we push her just a little bit, and she will resist always, that once we get her out and doing things as a family, she finds a lot of joy in that. And she really is enjoying the experience. And then we just, you know, help her learn to create balance. Like, hey, we're going to go do this thing as a family. Also, giving her a lot of information really helps because of how her brain works. So we're going here, we're going to do A, B, and C. It's going to take us about this amount of time. And I'll even say to her, I'm going to need you to be flexible, though, because it could take up to an hour more than we expect it to, right? Yeah. And then we make a deal. So once we've done that and we get back home, I'm going to give you half an hour to just veg out on your phone before we start talking about what we're going to do for supper, right? Like, so we just kind of have to talk her through more of a detailed schedule and what to expect and when to expect it, so that she can feel safe in pushing herself to that edge. And we create that safety, all those details, so she knows, like, okay, I don't want to, but I'm going to go do this because I know here's the safety net that's set up for me afterwards.
I think what's beautiful about that is you're building a couple of things. One, you're building trust with her, that she knows and feels safe. Like, you hear her, you know what she needs. You are putting her needs as a priority to make sure that, you know, she gets what she needs, but also you're also kind of letting her know that she's bigger city, that yes, you have these things that respect your boundaries, but you are still part of this community that is a family, and there's an expectation there as well, and that we need to work together as a unit. So I think that's a really beautiful way to kind of frame that.
Yeah, for sure. And it's easy as a parent and we've certainly had those moments where we're like, you spend too much time on your phone. We're going to shut down your phone. Like getting into that like threat negotiation. Like, yeah. And, we have to just like take a deep breath when we're feeling that as a parent, like this is wrong. You shouldn't be tuning out like this. And just remember, okay, part of this is she's a teen and she's trying to, again, like gain that autonomy. She's self-isolating a bit because, she just wants that alone time and she enjoys time with herself, which I tell her all the time, like, that's awesome. Like enjoying time by yourself is like something a lot of people struggle with. And what a great skill to have for your life to enjoy your own company. And at the same time, I have to like take a breath from that. Like you're on your phone too much and just say, hey, you know what? We miss you. Your family is missing you. You're spending a lot of time in your room. And I just want to check in and make sure, like, is that just because you need the downtime or like, is there anything bothering you? Because now you also have to worry about depression and, things going on you're not telling us about at school. Like neurodivergent kids are more likely to be bullied at school, and sometimes that's subtle. So you don't always know. So just a lot of checking in, being like, hey, are you happy right now being on your own? And like for my child, she's always like, yep, I'm really happy. I'm fine, Mom. Like quit worrying about me. I just want to be alone, like leave me alone. I'm like, okay, great. Yeah. So we're talking about that edge. We're trying to find that edge as a family unit and as individuals of like, where do we push ourselves out of that comfort zone a little bit? Because the comfort zone is very comforting, but long-term, that buildup of self-isolation can lead to depression and other things, right? So we're talking to her about that and being like, hey, we get that you're really happy about this time by yourself right now. But just know, like, it's not really healthy to just always be alone or always be in your room by yourself or always be on your phone, right? So just educating about balance and how a healthy life means finding that balance and that edge.
Jen, I, as always, like love your perspective on all of this and everything. I always, get new ideas every time I chat with you about our kiddos and all of that. And I know that people are listening are too. We could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours. In fact, we have before. But if there was maybe like, one or two lessons that you learned or things that if you wish you would have known at the beginning, or just like even a couple tips that you might want to leave people with, if they're listening to this and they're like noticing maybe we need to be having a different kind of conversation for kiddo, or maybe there's something we're not, paying attention to, or something with the school, kind of any last word of advice you would want to share?
Yeah, I would say as a parent to just know, like, you are your child's best advocate, and doing some reading, looking into perspectives of adults who actually, can use some of that same language to describe themselves as your child, and looking to those people for direction is one of the best things you could do. When our oldest first received her diagnosis, I remember being in a complete panic and just wondering, like, what does this mean for her life, for our family, like, and just feeling kind of lost and overwhelmed. And if I could go back to like myself at that moment, I would just say, this is going to be okay. And this is just a learning curve. It's something you have to learn, but I would let your child lead. And I think in every situation, we've made a lot of decisions over the years of like to homeschool at some points and put them in school at other points. And each step of the way, those decisions have been made by letting our children lead and letting them tell us with their words and their behavior and their feelings what they need in that moment. And just remembering that your job as a parent isn't to fix everything. It's just to listen, to be there, to show up for them, create that safe space, and be their best advocate, while also teaching them to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, I love that. So good. Well, Jen, if people maybe want to connect with you, if you're open to that, or if they want to learn more about your new biz, I know you probably don't. Do you ship your delicious?
I don't ship. No, it's just local for that. Yep.
Well, but how could people maybe reach out if they have a question or if they just want to connect or?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to talk with other parents or just offer support. So any questions you have, you can email me at Jen Anderson. It's Anderson with an SON, studio@gmail.com. And I'll get back to you when I can. But yeah, I welcome any questions. This is something I love talking about because it's very integrated into my life here as a parent with 2 kids that each have their own unique brains. So it's something I've learned a lot about over the past 13 years, and I'm happy to share that knowledge. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, for openness and honesty. I think this is a great conversation for people to continue to have.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you laying it all out there and being so good.
Thanks, Sami. I really appreciate it.
I just want to thank Jen again so much for being a guest and being so open and honest about her family but family life and the girls and how they're kind of navigating through all the things. School here is back in session and we're feeling it also. And so I just love having these kinds of conversations where we really get to just kind of work through as moms, as parents, as dads, kind of what it takes, and that every child is unique and has their own story to tell. So you can check out the show notes and additional resources for this episode at easystylewithsami.com/28. Sorry, easystylewithsami.com/28. Thank you so much for listening. I love sharing these stories and having conversations with people in my world and new people that I get to meet. If you know somebody that would have an amazing story to tell on the Easy Style with Sami podcast, shoot me an email. Sami@easystylewithsami.com. That's SAMI. And I hope that you will subscribe wherever you listen so you don't miss out on any episodes. Wow, I'm having a hard time talking today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one.